So good morning, class. My name is Professor Gates, and I'm going to talk to you today about the use of light, the use and meaning of light in architecture and in your designs, and how the consideration of light as a material substance of design is an extraordinarily powerful way to think about the design of space, to begin to think about the design of space, because every space that people use demands the use of light in some way. And when you're designing a space, usually you're designing it with some meaning in mind for the space. So some spaces require a lot of light, and some spaces require natural light, some spaces require artificial light. So your consideration of light as a substance of design is really relevant. But today, before we get started, I just want to see how everyone's doing. And I want to tell you a little story about something that happened to me this weekend that made me think about today's lecture and made me sort of realize things about Gothic architecture and the use of meaning of light in Gothic architecture that I think is relevant for today's lecture. So there's a lake by my house that I walk around frequently, and it's a beautiful lake, and there's a trail that goes around the edge of the lake, and on either side there are these really tall trees that rise up almost like columns, almost like the columns in the nave of a Gothic cathedral. So remember, the nave is the sort of central aisle of a Gothic cathedral, and you have these towering columns that were rising up really high, so that they can open up the space between the columns and make these really beautiful stained glass windows, so that natural light would come in through these windows and illuminate the sort of stained glass designed windows that would tell some religiously significant story that the church wanted people to be aware of and to be mindful of when they were there. So that's just, as I was walking down this path, it made me think about that, because the trees were creating this real sort of Gothic pointed arch as the trunks went up and broke into branches and then sort of made this arch shape. The light was coming down through the trees and bouncing off of the water and coming in from the side, and it made me think about Gothic architecture and how the use of light in Gothic architecture was designed. So that was something that happened to me this weekend, and it was a sort of nice experience, you know. So I wanted to talk to you today also about another space that I think you should all be familiar with, and that's the Guggenheim Museum in New York City by the architect Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright was a brilliant architect of the 20th century, and he designed an extraordinary number of buildings. And in New York City, he designed, I think, only two buildings. One is the Guggenheim Museum, and the other was a small residential building on Staten Island called the Crimson Beach House. But the Guggenheim Museum is the one I want to talk to you about today, because I think the use of light in that building is extraordinary. And the reason for that is that the design of the building, which, if you're not familiar with, I'll explain it briefly. So the building is in New York City. It's right across the street from Central Park, and the shape is sort of almost like it starts off as a ramp. You enter the space, and there's a ramp that sort of spirals up as you walk through the space. And as you go up, the spiral gets bigger and bigger, almost like you would imagine like a tornado spinning around. And as it goes up, it gets, or a funnel. As it goes up, it gets bigger and bigger. So, so what does that mean? What is the meaning of that? And one of the reasons I consider that building to be one of the best buildings of the 20th century is that the design of the space, this sort of spiraling ramp that moves up, I think relates to the meaning of the space. So the function relates to the meaning, and I'll get into that a little more. Let's think about it like this: what is a museum? I think you have to think about that. Whenever you're designing a space, you think about what's the sort of essential nature of the space you're designing. So is it a restaurant? Is it a kitchen? Is it an auditorium? Is it a performance hall? Is it a dance theater? Is it someone's home? Is it a writing studio? Is it a school? So you have to think about this sort of essential nature of what the space is. So when you think about a museum, what is a museum, right? A museum is a space where you go to experience the work of artists, and and so it's sort of a home for art. And so, well, what is the experience of art, and why have human beings established museums as an institution for a way of life and for a way of being? Like, what's the relevance here? So, for me, I think the consideration of that relevance is that artists possess or try to communicate sort of a sense of wisdom and understanding and a way of seeing the world that is can be very beautiful and very meaningful. So these museums house these works of art that people go to experience. And why do you want to experience art? Because it changes the way you see the world, right? It gives you a way of seeing things through the eyes of someone else. Very much like reading a book, like a library almost. So the experience of artwork in museums is an enlightening experience, right? It's an enlightening experience because you come away from a museum having thought about more and having experienced sort of the work of the artist in ways that you didn't have before you went to the museum. So it's a process of moving through a space. The physicality of a museum is a process of moving through a space in which you experience artwork for the purpose of becoming enlightened. So how does that relate to the design of the museum? Well, you have this sort of spiral that sort of starts kind of small, and you go up this ramp, and then you work around and around and around and around this ramp that gets bigger and bigger. And of course, it's an atrium space that goes up, and at the top there's a big dome which is glazed, which is it's big skylight basically. So you have light pouring down the center of this space. So what I think is beautiful about this space is that as you move through the space, right, as you start at the bottom and you slowly work your way up this museum, going around and around, seeing artwork as you go, you're becoming enlightened through the process of moving through the space, because you're seeing artwork as you go up, right, as you work your way up. And it's difficult because you're walking up. So learning and acquiring wisdom is an effort because you have to walk up. So you have to apply yourself to experience to gain this wisdom. And as you're moving up and up, the space is sort of opening up as you go up. So you're getting more and more physical, like more and more light, natural light that's pouring down from this atrium space. So not only are you physically moving through the space, becoming enlightened through the experience of the artwork, but you're also moving up into the light until finally you get to the top and you look up and that's where you see, that's where you're closest to the light, the natural light that's pouring into the space. So what makes this building sort of one of the best buildings of the 20th century is basically that the design of the space relates to the meaning of the space. The meaning of the space is that you go to this museum to become enlightened through the experience of masterful works of artists. And the building itself is a metaphor for that. It's for entering, moving through a space, and moving up into the light. So you are meaningfully becoming enlightened through the experience of the artwork, and you're actually becoming enlightened because you're moving up into the light through that process. So the process of experiencing the space relates directly to the meaning of the space. And I think that's what makes this sort of Guggenheim Museum extraordinarily powerful building and a very, very beautiful space. So you can use light in that way in the spaces you design. And I think you need to think of it in the same way that Frank Lloyd Wright thought of it, as in terms of how can you use light expressively to reinforce the meaning of your spaces. So just to summarize today's thoughts, like, you want to think of light as a real consideration in the spaces that you design. And the sort of final thought I want to leave you with is that light is a giver of presence. It's a giver of sensibility and atmosphere in a space. So think about that when you design your spaces, and have a great day. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.